The morning sun painted golden streaks across Manhattan's towering buildings as Mai hurried through the bustling streets, her worn leather backpack bouncing against her shoulder. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of coffee from nearby cafes and the distant rumble of subway trains beneath her feet. As a third-year law student at Columbia University, she had grown accustomed to these early morning rushes, but today was different. Today was her bar exam preparation test, the one that would determine whether she was ready for the real thing in 3 months. Mai checked her phone again, 7:35 a.m. 25 minutes until the exam. Her heart raced as she weaved through the crowd of office workers and street vendors setting up their breakfast carts. She had stayed up until 3 a.m. reviewing contract law, fueled by instant noodles and determination. Being the first person in her family to attend college, let alone law school, meant every test carried the weight of her entire family's dreams. The street lights changed, and a wave of pedestrians surged forward. Mai clutched her practice exam materials closer, mentally reviewing the elements of negligence one more time. The sound of honking taxis and the chatter of tourists blended into white noise as she focused on reaching the test center. Just 3 more blocks to go. That's when she heard the commotion at the intersection ahead. A small crowd was gathering, their worried murmurs cutting through the usual city noise. Through gaps in the crowd, Mai spotted an elderly man on the ground. He was dressed in a postal worker's uniform, his mail bag scattered across the sidewalk. His weathered face was pale, one hand clutching his chest, while the other gripped the base of a street lamp. Time seemed to slow down as Mai glanced at her phone again, 7:38 a.m. The test center was so close, she could actually see the building from where she stood. Her scholarship, her future career, her family's hopes, everything hinged on her performance today. She had worked countless night shifts at the local diner and spent 2 years as a part-time library assistant just to afford her textbooks. Missing this exam could derail everything. But the old man's labored breathing echoed in her ears. Nobody in the growing crowd seemed to be doing anything besides taking videos with their phones or whispering to each other. Some people even walked past, their eyes glued to their screens, as if the scene was just another obstacle in their morning commute. The man tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, my grandchildren, waiting." Mai's grip on her backpack tightened. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, words she had heard countless times growing up in their small apartment above the family restaurant. In this world, we must be the kindness we wish to see. The next few seconds felt like watching herself in a movie. Her feet were moving before her mind could fully process the decision. The practice exam materials found their way back into her backpack as she pushed through the crowd, her voice cutting through the morning air with a clarity that surprised even her. "Sir, I'm here to help. Has anyone called an ambulance?" The morning sun continued its climb over Manhattan, indifferent to the small drama unfolding on its streets. But in that moment, as Mai knelt beside the elderly postal worker, something shifted in the universe. Neither she nor anyone else watching could have guessed how this simple act of kindness would ripple through time, touching lives far beyond that busy street corner. A well-dressed businessman in the back of a black luxury car watched the scene unfold through his tinted windows, stuck in the morning traffic. His driver started to complain about the crowd blocking their way, but he raised his hand for silence, his eyes fixed on the young woman who had chosen compassion over convenience. There was something about her decision that stirred a long-forgotten memory in his mind. The crowd parted as Mai took charge of the situation, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed 911, but years of helping at her family's busy restaurant had taught her to stay calm in emergencies. The dispatcher's voice crackled through her phone, asking for details about the location and the man's condition. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Mai asked gently, putting her phone on speaker while keeping one hand on the elderly man's shoulder. Her other hand found his, and she was struck by how cold his fingers felt in the autumn morning air. "Robert," he managed between shallow breaths. "Robert Kim. I need to finish my route. The Thompson kids, waiting for their college acceptance letters." His eyes darted anxiously to his scattered mailbag, decades of dedication showing even in his distress. Mai squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Mr. Kim, those letters can wait. Right now, you're what matters." She noticed his breathing becoming more labored and remembered the basic first aid training she'd taken during her summer job as a camp counselor. Keeping her voice calm, she helped him into a more comfortable position, using her backpack, full of crucial exam materials, as a pillow. Time seemed to move differently on that busy street corner. The usual New York rush continued around them, but May had created a small bubble of calm. She talked softly to Mr. Kim about his grandchildren, learning about his grandson's dreams of becoming a doctor and his granddaughter's talent for painting. Each story seemed to help steady his breathing, even as his grip on her hand remained tight. A young office worker stopped to help gather the scattered mail, carefully placing it back in the bag. Others in the crowd who had been filming with their phones slowly put them away, some looking slightly ashamed. A street vendor appeared with a paper cup of water and a folded jacket to keep Mr. Kim warm. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning noise. May glanced at her phone, 8:15 a.m. Her exam had started 15 minutes ago. The thought sent a wave of anxiety through her stomach, but one look at Mr. Kim's grateful eyes pushed those worries aside. This moment wasn't about her future anymore. It was about making sure someone else had a future to look forward to. The paramedics arrived with practiced efficiency, their questions precise and movements quick. As they prepared to load Mr. Kim into the ambulance, one of them turned to May. "You did good, kid." The quick response and keeping him calm. "You probably saved his life. Not many people would stop these days." Mr. Kim reached for May's hand one last time. "Your parents must be very proud," he whispered, his eyes bright with gratitude. "What's your name?" "I want my grandchildren to know about the angel who helped their grandfather." May felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'm just someone who did what anyone should do," she replied softly, thinking of all the times her mother had helped struggling customers at their restaurant, often giving free meals to those who couldn't pay. As the ambulance pulled away, its sirens fading into the city's symphony, May stood alone on the sidewalk. The small crowd had dispersed, the morning drama over, leaving her with the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her study group, probably wondering where she was. In the back of the luxury car, still idling nearby due to traffic, the businessman made a quick phone call. "Find out everything you can about that young woman," he said quietly, watching as May gathered her backpack, her shoulders straight despite the obvious cost of her choice. "And get me the dean of Columbia Law School on the line." The morning sun had fully risen now, warming the cool autumn air. As May walked slowly toward the test center, knowing it was too late but needing to try anyway, she felt oddly at peace. Something her grandmother used to say echoed in her mind. Sometimes the right path isn't the easy one, but it's the one that lets you sleep at night. The test center lobby felt colder than usual as Mai pushed through the heavy glass doors. Her footsteps echoed in the nearly empty space, a stark contrast to the usual nervous energy of test day mornings. At the front desk, Mrs. Rivera, the exam administrator, looked up from her computer with a mix of recognition and resignation. "I can explain," Mai started, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. She pulled out her phone, showing the call log to 911, and tried to describe what had happened. But Mrs. Rivera's expression remained unchanged, her decades of experience with student excuses evident in the firm set of her mouth. "Rules are rules," Mrs. Rivera said, not unkindly. "The exam began at 8:00 a.m. sharp. We can't make exceptions. It wouldn't be fair to the other students." She slid a form across the desk. "You can file an appeal, but I should warn you, these are rarely approved." Mi's fingers traced the edge of the paper, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just any practice exam, it was the qualifying test for her scholarship continuation. Without it, the careful balance of her life would start to crumble. Later that afternoon, in Professor Liu's office, the reality of her situation became even clearer. The kind-faced academic advisor who had mentored her since her first year looked troubled as she reviewed Mi's file on her computer. "Your academic record is outstanding," Professor Liu began, adjusting her reading glasses. "But the scholarship committee is very strict about attendance and testing requirements." She turned the monitor so Mai could see the scholarship terms, highlighted in unforgiving black and white. "Missing this exam puts your entire funding package at risk." The autumn sun streaming through the office window felt like a spotlight, highlighting every worry line on May's face. "I couldn't just walk away," she said softly, more to herself than to her advisor. He needed help. Professor Liu's expression softened. "I understand, and personally, I admire what you did. But the committee won't see it that way. They'll said you could have called 911 and continued to your exam, that you didn't need to stay." She paused, shuffling some papers on her desk. "We're talking about potentially losing your scholarship for the final year. That's over $50,000. The number hit May like a physical blow. Images flashed through her mind. Her parents' proud faces at her acceptance ceremony, her father's calloused hands from decades of kitchen work to support her dreams, her mother's secret trips to the pawn shop with her wedding jewelry during May's first year of school. "Is there anything I can do?" May asked, hating how her voice cracked. Professor Liu leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. "File the appeal." "I'll write a strong letter of support, but—" She trailed off, leaving the unlikelihood of success hanging in the air. "You might want to start looking into emergency loans, and maybe consider extending your graduation timeline, taking fewer classes while working more hours." The walk home from campus felt endless. The city streets that had witnessed her morning act of kindness now seemed indifferent to her struggles. Outside her family's restaurant, May paused, watching through the window as her parents moved efficiently through the dinner rush. Her mother was showing a new waitress how to carry multiple plates, the same way she taught May when she was 12. Her father's laugh carried through the glass as he joked with regular customers while cooking. She couldn't tell them. Not yet. They had sacrificed too much already. Her phone buzzed. A text from her study group asking if she was okay, followed by a string of worried messages about the exam she'd missed. As she started to reply, another message came through, from the hospital where they'd taken Mr. Kim. His granddaughter had found May's number in his phone and wanted to let her know he was stable and asking about her. May sat on the steps of her family's restaurant, the familiar smells of her childhood wafting through the air. A small smile crossed her face despite everything. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Money comes and goes, but the way you treat people, that stays forever." In his downtown office, the businessman who had witnessed everything was making calls, his determination growing with each new piece of information his team uncovered about the young law student who had chosen compassion over convenience. Sometimes, he thought, the most valuable qualities in a lawyer couldn't be taught in any classroom. David Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, the city sprawling beneath him like a glittering circuit board. His fingers traced the familiar rough spot on his gold watch, a scratch from 30 years ago when he pawned it to pay for his own bar exam. The morning's events kept playing in his mind, stirring memories he thought he'd buried under decades of corporate success. "Sir," his assistant, Mrs. Wu, entered with a stack of folders. "I have the information you requested about the law student." She placed them carefully on his mahogany desk, each folder labeled with meticulous precision. David turned from the window, his reflection ghosting against the cityscape behind him. At 58, his hair had more silver than black now, but his eyes retained the sharp focus that had helped build his law firm into a billion-dollar empire. He sat down, opening the first folder. "Mei Lin," he read aloud, studying the university photo. "Third-year law student at Columbia. Full academic scholarship." His eyes moved down the page. "Parents own a small restaurant in Queens. Works part-time at the university library and weekend shifts at a diner." He paused, a small smile touching his lips. "Top 5% of her class despite the working hours." Mrs. Wu nodded. "She reminds me of someone," she said quietly, having worked with David for over 20 years. David's mind drifted back to a rainy morning in 1990. He had been rushing to an interview at a prestigious law firm, his only suit carefully protected under an umbrella, when he'd spotted an elderly woman falling on the slippery sidewalk. The choice he'd made that day had cost him the interview and that job opportunity, but had led him to a smaller firm where he'd met his mentor. "What about the postal worker?" he asked, moving to another folder. "Mr. Robert Kim is stable. It was a minor heart attack. The doctors say if he hadn't received help so quickly." Mrs. Wu trailed off meaningfully. "He's worked that route for 35 years, never missed a day until now." David stood again, walking to a wooden cabinet in the corner of his office. Inside, behind crystal glasses and expensive bottles, sat a worn leather mailbag. He pulled it out gently, the leather soft with age. "My father carried one just like this," he said softly, more to himself than to Mrs. Wu. "Walked his route for 42 years. Said you could judge a society by how it treats its postal workers. They carry people's dreams, heartbreaks, and futures in their bags every day." He returned to his desk, picking up Mi's file again. Her academic records showed a perfect balance of intelligence and hard work. But it was the testimonials from her part-time jobs that caught his attention. The diner owner wrote about how she stayed late to help elderly customers home on rainy nights. The library supervisor mentioned how she tutored struggling first-year students for free during her lunch breaks. "She's not just smart," David mused, "she's kind." And nowadays, that's a rare combination in our profession. He pressed the intercom button. "Get me Dean Richardson at Columbia Law School, and find out which judge is handling bar exam appeals this month." Mrs. Wu paused at the door. "Sir, are you sure about getting involved? The firm's board has been pushing for a more conventional approach to recruitment." David smiled, picking up a framed photo from his desk, a much younger version of himself standing with an elderly man in front of a small law office. "You know what my old mentor used to say? The law needs more people who see humans first and cases second." He set the photo down carefully. "Besides, I've been looking for someone to carry on the firm's pro bono division, someone who understands why it matters." Through his window, he could see the street corner where May had stopped that morning. The city had already moved on, the spot now occupied by a hot dog vendor and rushing pedestrians. But that moment of choice, between personal gain and human kindness, had created ripples that were still spreading. His phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Mr. Kim was asking to meet the young woman who had helped him, wanting to thank her properly. David smiled, knowing that gratitude could open doors that money and influence couldn't. Sometimes the universe had its own way of balancing the scales. "One more thing," he called to Mrs. Wu. "Find out if that diner where she works serves good coffee. I think it's time I had breakfast in Queens." The early morning light was just beginning to touch the edges of Queens when David Chen's car pulled up outside the Golden Dragon restaurant. Through the window, he could see a young woman wiping down tables, her law textbook propped open against a napkin holder. The sign on the door still read closed, but the smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee drifted through the cracks. He watched as an older woman, May's mother, according to his files, came out from the kitchen, gently closing her daughter's textbook and replacing it with a bowl of steaming noodles. The tender gesture reminded him of his own mother, who had worked as a seamstress to support his education. "Mrs. Wu," he spoke quietly to his assistant in the car, "what else did you learn?" His assistant opened her tablet, scrolling through her notes. "The restaurant has been in the family for 20 years. They opened it with a loan from the entire extended family. May started helping when she was 10, doing homework between taking orders." She paused, pulling up another document. Her first job outside the restaurant was at age 16, tutoring middle school students in math. She used the money to buy her parents their first computer. David nodded, his eyes still on the restaurant. A steady stream of early morning customers had started arriving. Construction workers, nurses ending night shifts, office cleaners heading home. He noticed how each one was greeted by name, how some had their orders started before they even sat down. "What about her law school activities?" "She volunteers at the legal aid clinic 3 evenings a week," Mrs. Wu continued. "The supervisor there said she's particularly good with elderly clients. Last month, she helped a grandmother keep her apartment after the building tried to illegally evict her." She swiped to another screen. She also started a study group for first-generation law students, sharing tips about navigating law school when you don't have family connections in the field. Through the window, they watched as Mai brought coffee to an elderly man wearing a security guard uniform. She sat with him for a moment, apparently helping him with some paperwork he brought in. Her mother appeared with extra toast on the house. "The diner where she works weekends," Mrs. Wu added, said she's never missed a shift in 2 years. The owner mentioned that she keeps a small notebook of regular customer stories, their kids' names, their struggles, their dreams. Says it helps her remember that behind every legal case is a real person. David's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Mr. Kim, the postal worker, was being released today. His granddaughter had sent a photo of him sitting up in bed, holding a thank you card he wanted to give to Mai. The message mentioned how he kept telling the nurses about the angel in a hurry who had stopped to help him. The dean's office sent over her complete academic file, Mrs. Wu said, opening another folder. Her admission essay was about working in the restaurant and learning more about law from watching her parents handle health inspections and contract negotiations than from any textbook. She wrote about how every small business owner is really a jack of all trades, part lawyer, part accountant, part social worker. David smiled, remembering his own law school application. He'd written about delivering newspapers with his father, learning the value of showing up every day, rain or shine. Simple lessons that had shaped his entire career. Her professor's notes are interesting, Mrs. Wu continued. They say she has a unique way of approaching legal problems, always looking for the human element, not just the technical solution. Professor Lee wrote that she once turned in a contract law assignment that included a section on how to explain complex legal terms to clients who speak English as a second language. The morning rush at the restaurant was picking up now. They watched as Mai expertly balanced plates while explaining something from her textbook to a younger student who appeared to be asking for advice. Even with the busy morning chaos, she took a moment to help an elderly customer with her walker before returning to her duties. The scholarship committee is meeting tomorrow, Mrs. Wu reminded him. They'll be reviewing her appeal then. David checked his watch, the same one he'd pawned and later reclaimed all those years ago. Set up meetings with the committee members. Individual meetings, not a group session. He paused, watching as Mai helped her father carry in supplies from a delivery truck, her law books momentarily set aside. And get me everything you can find about their pro bono program. I want to know what kind of cases they're handling, what kind of support they're offering students who want to do public interest law. Mrs. Wu made a final note. The security footage from that morning has been recovered. It shows the entire incident, including how many people walked past before she stopped. She hesitated. Sir, even if we can't help with the scholarship, that footage might be worth sharing. People should see that kindness still exists in this city. David nodded, reaching for his coffee. Sometimes, Mrs. Wu, the best legal education happens outside the classroom. And sometimes, the best investments aren't the ones that show up on a balance sheet. He watched as Mai returned to her textbook, determination evident in every movement. We're not just looking for another lawyer here. We're looking for someone who remembers why they wanted to practice law in the first place. The mahogany-paneled conference room at Columbia Law School felt unusually tense that afternoon. Dean Richardson sat at the head of the long table, surrounded by members of the scholarship committee. The autumn sun streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across their serious faces as they reviewed the appeal documents in front of them. The quiet was broken by a gentle knock at the door. Mrs. Wu entered first, her tablet ready, followed by David Chen. The committee members straightened in their chairs. Everyone in New York's legal community knew about the billionaire lawyer who had started from nothing. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, David began, standing at the end of the table. He nodded to Mrs. Wu, who dimmed the lights and started a projection on the wall. The security camera footage began to play, showing that fateful morning from multiple angles. They watched in silence as dozens of people walked past Mr. Kim. Some glanced at their phones, others hurried by with coffee cups, a few even stepped around him. Then Mai appeared in the frame, her decision to stop playing out in crystal clear detail. I've practiced law in this city for over 30 years, David said quietly as the footage continued. I've won cases worth billions, argued before the Supreme Court, and built what some call a legal empire. But today, I'm here to talk about something more important than any of that, the kind of people we want representing our profession. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, removing an old newspaper clipping. 30 years ago, I missed an interview at a top firm because I stopped to help someone who had fallen. I thought I'd ruined my career. He smiled slightly. Instead, that decision led me to a smaller firm where I met my mentor, who taught me that the law isn't just about winning cases, it's about helping people. Mrs. Wu switched to another slide, showing Mai's academic record and volunteer work. This student isn't just top of her class, She's someone who understands that being a lawyer means being part of a community. She tutors other students, volunteers at legal clinics, and yes, stops to help strangers even when it costs her something precious. Dean Richardson leaned forward. Mr. Chen, while we admire the students' actions, rules exist for a reason. If we make an exception, then we show that this institution values character as much as it values test scores. David interrupted gently. He gestured to the committee members. Look around this room. Every one of us has a story about someone who gave us a chance, who saw our potential beyond the numbers on a page. He walked to the window, looking out at the campus below where students hurried between classes. I've interviewed hundreds of lawyers over the years, many of them brilliant, all of them qualified. But do you know what's becoming rare? Finding someone who remembers that behind every case file is a human being. Someone who understands that the greatest legal skill isn't knowing every precedent, it's knowing when to stop and help. Mrs. Wu played one final video, interviews with customers from the diner where May worked, elderly clients from the legal clinic, fellow students she had tutored. Each person spoke about her kindness, her dedication, her way of making complex legal concepts understandable to everyone. The bar exam board has already agreed to allow a makeup test, David continued. But that's not why I'm here. He turned back to face the committee. I'm here because 30 years ago, someone took a chance on me when I chose compassion over convenience. Today, we have the same choice. He placed a folder on the table. Inside this folder is a proposal. My firm wants to expand its pro bono division, focusing on helping small businesses and elderly clients, the people who often fall through the cracks in our legal system. We're looking for someone to lead this initiative after graduation, someone who understands both the law and the people it serves. The room was quiet as the committee members exchanged glances. Dean Richardson picked up the folder, reading through the proposal with raised eyebrows. This is very generous, she said carefully. David smiled. It's not generosity, it's investment in the future of our profession. He nodded to Mrs. Wu, who distributed more folders. The proposal includes funding for a new scholarship program, supporting students who want to pursue public interest law. Because sometimes the most important legal work happens not in courtrooms, but in small restaurants, on city streets, and in community centers. He looked around the room, meeting each committee member's eyes. Today, we're not just deciding about one student's scholarship. We're deciding what kind of lawyers we want to shape our future. Do we want people who just follow rules, or do we want people who know when to break them for the right reasons? The afternoon sun had shifted, casting different shadows now. Outside, life on campus continued, students debating cases, professors giving lectures, future lawyers learning about a system they would someday help shape. And in that quiet room, a group of people who had dedicated their lives to the law faced a simple but profound question. What matters more? The letter of the law or its spirit? Dean Richardson closed the folder slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Well, she said, looking around at her colleagues, I believe we have some decisions to make. The Golden Dragon restaurant was unusually busy that Sunday morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the steam rising from bowls of noodles and cups of coffee. May moved between tables with practiced ease, her mind still processing the events of the past week. The bell above the door chimed as Mr. Kim entered, looking much better than the last time she'd seen him. He was accompanied by his grandchildren, a teenage girl clutching a sketchbook and a boy wearing a junior volunteer badge from the hospital where he hoped to become a doctor someday. There she is, Mr. Kim said warmly, his eyes crinkling with joy. The angel who saved my life. Mi's parents emerged from the kitchen, wiping their hands on their aprons. They had heard the story countless times by now, but still beamed with pride every time someone mentioned it. Her father pulled up extra chairs to their best table, while her mother disappeared back into the kitchen, returning with special dumplings she'd been saving for this moment. I have something for you, the granddaughter said shyly, opening her sketchbook. She'd drawn a beautiful portrait of May helping her grandfather, capturing the moment of kindness in delicate pencil strokes. At the bottom, she'd written, sometimes angels wear backpacks. The door chimed again. This time, Dean Richardson entered, followed by David Chen and Mrs. Wu. They were dressed casually, no suits or formal attire today. David carried a worn leather briefcase that had seen decades of use. "Hope we're not interrupting," Dean Richardson said with a smile. "We brought some news that couldn't wait until Monday." Mee's mother quickly arranged more chairs, bringing out her special tea set, the one reserved for important occasions. The small restaurant had become a gathering place where different worlds were colliding. Education and family, success and struggle, past and future. First, Dean Richardson began, accepting a cup of tea. "The makeup exam has been scheduled for next week." She paused, watching relief wash over Mee's face. "But that's not the biggest news." David opened his briefcase, removing several documents. "The scholarship committee didn't just approve your appeal," he said, sliding the papers across the table. "They've created a new program because of you, the Community Spirit Scholarship. It's for students who demonstrate exceptional character alongside academic excellence." Mee's hands trembled as she read the documents. Not only was her current scholarship secure, but the new program would help other students like her, those who understood that law books were just the beginning of a legal education. "There's more," Mrs. Wu added, bringing out another folder. "Mr. Chen's firm is launching a new division focused on helping small businesses and elderly clients. They need someone to lead it after graduation, someone who understands both the law and the human side of legal work." Mr. Kim reached across the table, patting Mee's hand. "See, good things happen to good people. My grandfather used to say that kindness always finds its way home." The restaurant had grown quieter, other customers sensing the importance of the moment. Mee's father brought out his special rice wine, reserved for celebrations. "To my daughter," he said proudly, his English accented but clear, who remembered what we always taught her, that success means nothing without kindness. David raised his glass, looking around the small restaurant. "To the future of law," he added, "where compassion and justice walk hand in hand." As they celebrated, more people began arriving, regular customers who had heard the news, students Mai had tutored, elderly clients from the legal clinic. The small restaurant buzzed with conversation and laughter. Mr. Kim's grandson eagerly discussed his medical school dreams with a doctor who was a regular customer. His granddaughter showed her sketches to an art teacher who promised to help her apply to art school. Mai watched it all, remembering that morning when she had to choose between an exam and helping a stranger. Her mother came up beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "See," she whispered, "sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead us exactly where we need to be." The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the restaurant windows, highlighting the simple truth that had brought them all together. In a world that often prioritized success over kindness, there was still room for both. And sometimes, choosing compassion wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the beginning of something much bigger than yourself. David Chen watched from his corner table, remembering his own journey from a struggling student to a successful lawyer. In Mee, he saw the future of his profession, not just sharp minds and ambitious dreams, but hearts that remembered why laws existed in the first place: to protect, to serve, and to make the world a little bit better, one person at a time.